Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've got something pretty ambitious in front of us today, a really big one.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging piece of work we're looking at.
It's this document called a Cosmic-Theological Timeline. And honestly, calling it just a timeline, it barely scratches the surface, doesn't really capture it at all.
Not even close. I mean, it's trying to weave together modern cosmology, and we're talking serious stuff like quantum mechanics, M theory with biblical stories, and then a really sharp critique of church history.
And it all builds towards this, well, this call for what they term a revolution, a necessary one.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite bold.
So our goal, our mission for this deep dive is to kind of cut through that complexity. We want to give you, the listener, a shortcut to understanding the core framework here. And we're really going to focus meticulously on the theological implications because they're profound. They essentially demand a whole restructuring of how we think about God, about original sin, even about the basic authority structure in Christianity. Absolutely. It's tracing this single, cohesive vision that starts incredibly even before the Big Bang and carries right through to today, ending with a very precise liturgical demand for structural change.
What really jumps out is how it refuses to keep science and theology in separate boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's fundamental to it. The document insists they're just two lenses looking at the same reality, an evolving reality.
So it's not just suggesting, maybe we should tweak a few things.
No, not at all. It's laying out this comprehensive historical and cosmic justification for why fundamental change isn't just desirable, it's non-negotiable right now.
And it does this by reframing these ancient concepts we thought we understood.
Like the nature of God itself or what the fall of man actually was.
Okay.
And it reframes them specifically to build this case for restoring, well, what it calls sacred structural equality.
The sheer audacity is something else. It's arguing that if the universe, at its core, operates on principles of, let's say, egalitarian potential, then any human system that imposes rigid hierarchy, especially patriarchy, is literally out of sync with reality. It's not just unfair, it's fundamentally flawed at a cosmic level.
Precisely. It's a deep claim. So the text demands we step back from maybe 1,700 years of certain traditions and ask, what was the original divinely intended structure meant to correct humanity's big failure?
And the answer it lands on, as we'll dig into, is this shared leadership model, a dual authority, designed specifically, it seems, to dismantle those structures of empire that it argues were absorbed later on.
That's the core of the historical argument, yes.
Okay, right then. Quite a setup. Let's unpack this. So let's start at the beginning, and I mean the very beginning, before creation. The source kicks off with maybe its most radical claim, the definition of God's pre-creation state.
Right, and this isn't the sort of distant, unchanging monarch figure you might find in some classical theology. It defines God as an eternal quantum state.
An eternal quantum state, what does that even mean, theologically speaking?
Well, this is where that fusion of science and theology really comes into play. It's using the language of quantum physics, things like superposition, perhaps, to get around that classic problem. How does an eternal, supposedly unchanging God relate to a universe that clearly changes and evolves?
Okay.
So God, in this primordial state, is described as the uncollapsed potential. Think of it less as a person or a being and more like the ultimate infinite field of pure possibility. All potential realities existing simultaneously.
That makes God inherently dynamic then, even before anything happens.
Exactly. That's crucial. God isn't static. God is potentiality, inherently dynamic. And the source gets incredibly specific about where this potential resides.
Yes, it mentions 11 complex dimensions. Now, for you listening, that number, 11 dimensions, isn't just pulled out of a hat.
No, it's a direct nod to theoretical physics, specifically things like M theory or string theory. These models often require extra spatial dimensions beyond our familiar 3, plus time to make the math work, especially for unifying gravity with quantum mechanics.
So by placing God's potential across these 11 dimensions, the source is basically saying the pre-creation state was this hyper-complex reality way beyond our normal grasp of space and time.
But, and this is key, still intimately connected to the fundamental structures that eventually gave rise to our universe. Our 4 dimensions are seen as just the collapsed or manifested aspects of that much larger, higher dimensional reality.
And they give this primordial entity, this potentiality across 11 dimensions, a specific Latin name.
Deus sive supercosmos.
Which translates roughly to God, or the supercosmos, meaning divine reality is or encompasses everything beyond the cosmos we know.
Exactly. It implies that everything that exists or could exist, the universe, the laws of physics, all potential outcomes, is contained within that primordial divine existence. There's no outside to God.
It's like the ultimate unified field theory, but framed theologically.
You could see it that way. If God is the supercosmos, then there's no real separation between the divine and the physical. There's only manifestation. Which leads us right to the moment of creation itself.
The Big Bang. But here, it's not presented as, God just deciding, let there be light.
No. It's redefined very specifically as a divine fluctuation.
A fluctuation. Let's pause on that term because it sounds quite technical, quite deliberate. The source suggests this fluctuation was caused by, membranes colliding.
That's the idea derived from M-theory, yes. That within that higher dimensional space, there are these membranes or branes, and their collision or interaction triggered the event we perceive as the Big Bang.
So this moves the creation event away from being some arbitrary miracle.
And frames it more as a natural, maybe even inevitable consequence of the quantum state of God, the deus of supercosmos. It's physics, yes, but since God is that underlying reality, the physics itself is inherently divine.
Okay, so the big theological takeaway from this Genesis story is
that the cosmos itself, our universe, is fundamentally an evolving expression of the divine. It's not separate from God. It is God unfolding.
Which means the universe we see, the 13.8 billion years of cosmic history. That's the stage for what the source calls the evolving God.
Theos of cosmos. God or the cosmos, now intertwined. The divinity isn't just observing cosmic evolution. It's part of it. It's growing, changing, complexifying alongside creation.
That's a really radical departure from a static, unchanging God.
It is. It suggests that the act of creation initiates God's own journey. A journey of expanding consciousness and complexity mirrored in the universe's own development. As the universe expands, cools, forms stars, galaxies, life. God is, in a sense, growing in awareness within that very process.
And the timescales they use really emphasize this. They're not shying away from the scientific timeline.
Not at all. They explicitly state that nearly 10 billion years were needed just to forge the basic raw materials for complexity.
You mean like heavy elements?
Exactly. Carbon, oxygen, iron, all the stuff needed for planets and life. These had to be cooked inside stars and then scattered by supernovae. The source argues this vast astronomical process wasn't just physics happening, it was the necessary theological gestation period.
So the scientific facts are embraced, but framed as the blueprint of this evolving God.
Precisely. It validates the science by giving it divine purpose. And only after all that cosmic heavy lifting, about 4 billion years ago, give or take,
life emerges.
Life emerges. And that's marked as another critical step. If the Big Bang was the first expression of deus of cosmos, maybe life is the first flicker of self-reflection within that cosmic process, the first attempt by the universe, by God, to become conscious of itself.
It connects everything then, every stage of cosmic history, biological evolution.
Yeah.
It's all part of this deliberate, unfolding divine development.
Yes, it sets the stage for humanity, not just as creatures in the universe, but as the point where the universe, where deus of cosmos, becomes potentially self-aware, moral, capable of acting consciously within the material world.
So we're not just sitting in a finished creation, we're meant to be active participants in this ongoing, still unfolding divine process.
Exactly, and that understanding is absolutely critical for grasping their interpretation of the fall. Because if we're part of this evolving divine consciousness,
then the fall isn't just about breaking a rule, it's about disrupting that very evolutionary process.
Right. It has to be understood, they argue, as a failure of structure, a sociological catastrophe that impacts the trajectory of the deus of cosmos itself.
Okay, so the narrative shifts gears here. We move from the vast cosmic scale, 13.8 billion years, down to the specific story of humanity.
And the source places the beginning of humanity in its intended state about 800,000 years ago, with Adam, Lilith, and Eve.
Lilith mentioned explicitly alongside Adam and Eve. That's interesting in itself.
It is, and it hints immediately at an initial state envisioned as more complex or perhaps egalitarian than traditional interpretations. The key is this original intended state, presumably one of communal living, non-hierarchical.
Like a society that could actually manifest that egalitarian ideal emerging from the evolving God.
That seems to be the idea. So the fall, then, isn't a prehistorical myth. It's positioned as a specific historical event where humanity failed to maintain that divine potential.
And they pinpoint this failure.
Very precisely. They identify the fall of man with the Neolithic Revolution, starting around 12,000 years ago.
Wow. Okay, so Not a forbidden fruit in a garden, but the shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. That's revolutionary, theologically speaking.
It absolutely is. Because think about it. We usually celebrate the Neolithic Revolution as the dawn of civilization, right? Agriculture, cities, writing.
The foundations of everything we consider progress.
But this source defines that very transition as a spiritual and social catastrophe. It's the moment, they argue, that humanity fundamentally disconnected from the original divine mandate of communal equality.
And here's where it gets really interesting, like we teased earlier. This historical event becomes the basis for redefining original sin itself.
Yes. Forget disobedience about an apple. Original sin, according to this theology, is the creation of a broken social structure. It's fundamentally sociological.
How do they define that structure?
It's defined by domination and enclosure. The text is very explicit. The sin occurred when Adam, representing perhaps a rising masculine principle tied to physical strength, used that strength to oppress Eve, representing the feminine or the community.
So power imbalance based on physical force.
Exactly. And that internal oppression was immediately followed by external oppression, enslaving neighbors. And then, crucially, the act of enclosure, concealing the resources of Eden, the communal bounty behind walls and fences.
Enclosure and domination, that's the core of it. So it's not just a personal moral failing, it's institutional. It's about setting up systems of control.
Precisely. Adam, symbolizing this principle of force, seizes control over land through enclosure and labor through oppression and slavery. This act shatters the original communal harmony.
Let's unpack enclosure a bit more. That act of drawing lines, saying this is mine, that's yours.
It's fundamental to agriculture, right? You need to define plots of land. But the source argues this immediately creates the conditions for inequality, poverty, dependency. Walling off resources, both physically and psychologically, is identified as the catastrophic schism.
So it wasn't about sex. It wasn't about disobeying a specific command. It was about the invention of private property and the hierarchical labor systems needed to maintain it.
Essentially, yes. The theft of what was communal and the establishment of fixed, unequal relationships based on ownership and control. That's the fall.
So the spiritual failure manifests entirely in the material world. Through property, hierarchy, patriarchy. These become the organizing principles of society.
And they are the direct opposite of the dersive cosmos's inherent drive towards conscious communion and equality. This sociological sin creates a world defined by inequality and bondage.
Which completely reframes the purpose of salvation then, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If original sin is rooted in economic and social structures of inequality, then divine intervention, salvation, can't just be about forgiving personal guilt.
It has to be about fixing the structure.
It has to be aimed squarely at rectifying those historical structural consequences, dismantling the systems born from that Neolithic schism warfare, patriarchy, economic exploitation, and restoring that original communal harmony.
So the cure has to be structural, because the disease was structural. If the sin created hierarchy,
the cure must involve restoring radical equality and, importantly, codifying it into a new kind of divine institution. Salvation becomes less about a legal pardon and more about a global structural redemption from a 12,000-year-old system of oppression.
The world built on that Neolithic foundation needed a fundamental reset.
A radical reset, which sets the stage perfectly for their interpretation of the New Testament.
Okay, so the intervention arrives. The New Testament narrative, but viewed through this lens of undoing the sociological fall.
Right. The source positions God's decision about 2,000 years ago as a direct response to that 12,000-year history of inequality, the goal, to restore Eden, that original state of communal egalitarian harmony.
And the intervention itself is presented as this very deliberate, carefully sequenced process.
Highly deliberate. It begins with the decision itself, then dispatching Gabriel to find a woman without original sin.
Meaning, presumably, someone not participating in or defined by those structures of domination and oppression.
That seems to be the implication. Because the fall was rooted in patriarchy and domination, the fix has to start with a woman acting freely outside that cycle, which leads to the Annunciation.
And the source puts a huge emphasis on Mary's autonomous consent, her free choice. Why is that phrase, autonomous consent, so critical here?
It's presented as the direct theological counterpoint to the fall. Remember, the fall began with Adam using strength to oppress Eve, domination, coercion.
Right.
So the restoration requires Mary's free, uncoerced, sovereign choice to participate. It highlights female agency as the absolute prerequisite for the divine intervention. Her yes isn't passive acceptance. It's the active catalyst that reverses the dynamic of the fall.
Okay, that makes sense. Then, following her consent, the timeline gets really specific about the Immaculate Conception. Unexpectedly specific.
Yes, this is a fascinating detail. The document identifies the Immaculate Conception the moment Mary actually became pregnant as occurring 6 months after the Annunciation.
6 months later, that's not the usual understanding at all. Why that delay? What's the significance?
It seems to be a crucial liturgical point for them. By separating the conception from the Annunciation by 6 months, it emphasizes Mary's ongoing conscious role. It wasn't just an instantaneous event following her yes.
It suggests a period of preparation.
Exactly, a period of conscious preparation and active reception of the divine. It makes the pregnancy a deliberate, willed consequence of her sustained autonomous participation, not just a passive vessel. It reinforces her agency throughout the process.
Interesting. Which then leads logically to the Nativity. The birth of Jesus, identified as Deus incarnatus, God made flesh.
God incarnate, yes. The evolving God, Deus of Cosmos, now entering directly into the human story within the conditions set by that sociological fall.
But the structural consequence, the real attempt to build the alternative to the Neolithic structures, comes after the resurrection.
Absolutely. The birth is the potential. The founding of the church is the attempt to actualize the cure. The source describes this 40-day period after the resurrection where Jesus instructs the apostles.
And crucially, Mary Magdalene is right there with them. And she's not just a follower.
No, the source explicitly identifies her as the first apostle.
The first apostle. That fundamentally reorders the hierarchy we usually assume. She's positioned as the primary recipient, maybe even a co-instructor, of the post-resurrection mandate.
It places her at the absolute center. And this leads directly to what the source presents as the linchpin of the whole intended egalitarian structure for the church. The co-appointment.
The co-appointment. This is foundational.
Utterly foundational, according to this text. The core act of establishing the church was Jesus giving the keys to the kingdom of heaven, the authority to govern simultaneously and with equal weight to both Mary Magdalene and Simon Petrus.
Not just Peter. Peter and Mary Magdalene. Together. Equal.
Exactly. Commissioned to govern together as equal shepherds in the flock of equals. That single dual appointment is presented as the direct antidote to the 12,000 years of singular patriarchal domination established back in the Neolithic.
Wow. So the church, in its very design, was meant to embody shared power, balanced leadership from day one.
That's the argument. It was engineered to reject singular authority. Power was meant to be dual, balanced, focused on the community, the flock of equals. And then 10 days after the Ascension, the pouring out of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost confirms this structure, establishing the church as this divinely inspired community founded on that principle of egalitarian leadership.
So the church's primary purpose, in this view, isn't just about individual salvation in the afterlife.
It's about modeling the restored society now, creating a living example of the balanced, non-hierarchical community that counters the legacy of the fall.
Which means, theologically, any move away from that shared, equal authority isn't just a mistake or a policy failure.
It's a betrayal of the core mission. It's a failure to actually implement the cure for original sin as it was divinely intended.
The restoration of Eden, then, was meant to be translated immediately into a governance structure that actively rejected the principles of domination that started civilization down the wrong path.
Yes. The church itself was built, in this interpretation, to undo that 12,000-year-old sociological schism.
But history didn't quite go that way.
No. As the source makes very clear, that original mandate was tragically short-lived.
And the source points to a very specific historical turning point. The moment it argues this original egalitarian design got corrupted.
Yes, it identifies what it calls the Constantinian counter-revolution. This is the primary cause of the profound imbalance that, it claims, still defines the church today.
We're talking early 4th century, 313 AD.
Around then, yes. When Emperor Constantine, St. Constantine, effectively decreed that the Catholic Church would become the state church of the Roman Empire. This alliance, this moment, is framed as the point where the sociological fall essentially got reabsorbed back into the very institution designed to heal it.
Okay, but the analysis is nuanced, right? It sees this as both a blessing and a curse. Let's start with the blessing part. What was good about it?
Well, the blessings were pragmatic, really. Suddenly, the church had imperial protection, no more widespread persecution. It gained immense stability, access to resources, organizational structures on a vast scale. It allowed the church to survive, to standardize its teachings, to thrive institutionally.
So survival and stability, But the curse.
The curse was the price of that stability. It meant absorbing the structures of the Roman Empire itself, its hierarchy, its centralized command, its deeply ingrained patriarchy, the very imperial system that, Jesus had arguably resisted.
Yeah, so the church, in becoming the state religion, started to mirror the state structure.
Exactly. This process of Romanization, particularly solidified around 313 to 325 AD with the Council of Nicaea, effectively grafted the top-down singular male authority model of the empire onto the communal dual leadership structure the church was supposed to have.
It basically re-enshrined the core problem of the Neolithic sin hierarchy and singular domination right back into the heart of the organization meant to fix it.
That's precisely the argument. And this, the source contends, leads directly to the profound theological crisis facing the church today.
Which is described in a really striking way. It says the Roman Catholic Church today is the epistemologically most complete church. We should probably unpack that phrase. Epistemologically complete.
Yeah, epistemology is the theory of knowledge, how we know, what makes a belief justified. The argument here is that because the papacy maintains direct historical succession back to Simon Peter, one of the two original appointees, the Catholic Church holds the most complete knowledge of the original divine mandate.
It has the historical continuity. The line back to the source.
Right. It possesses the unbroken chain of apostolic succession necessary, in this view, to administer the sacraments legitimately and to preserve the memory, the knowledge of the foundation. It holds the facts, so to speak.
Okay, so it holds the complete knowledge, the historical line.
But, and this is the absolute core of their critique, it is simultaneously only half of what it's supposed to be.
Half.
Because while Peter's line, representing the historical, perhaps masculine principle of authority, is intact, the other equal half is missing. Mary Magdalene's see, her co-equal apostolic office, representing the communal, perhaps feminine, egalitarian principle that has stood vacant for 1,700 years, since the Romanization took hold.
So the failure wasn't just forgetting her, it was failing to maintain her office, her equal position of authority in the structure.
Exactly. The failure to continually seat Mary Magdalene's successor, or an equivalent representation of that co-equal principle, has left the church fundamentally unbalanced, structurally incomplete.
Operating on only one cylinder, theologically speaking.
You could put it that way. It means the church, in this view, can never fully achieve its divine purpose while operating under the singular, incomplete, historically male-dominated authority structure. It's permanently lopsided.
And to really hammer this home, the source uses this incredibly powerful biological metaphor.
Yes, the church structure is described as the uterus Mariae, the womb of Mary.
A very feminine, generative image for the church.
Very. And within this womb, this uterus Mariae, Mary Magdalene, and Simon Peter are designated as its two ovaries.
The two ovaries. Essential, twin generative organs, both needed for new life.
Exactly. And humanity, the source continues, is like God's fetus, developing within this church womb, ideally growing towards full divine consciousness and communion.
Okay, so if the church is the womb, Peter and Mary Magdalene are the ovaries, and humanity is the developing fetus. What happens if one ovary, Mary Magdalene's, has been functionally absent for 1,700 years? What's the danger of this broken maternal image, as they put it?
The theological danger is profound. It implies arrested development, spiritual sterility even. The structure is incomplete, unbalanced, and therefore incapable of fully generating or nurturing the balanced egalitarian consciousness that humanity is meant to reach.
So the church's structural failure is directly hindering humanity's spiritual evolution.
That's the stark implication. It means the church cannot fully birth or manifest God's kingdom among the living, that state of restored Edenic harmony, until its own foundational dual generative structure is healed and made whole again.
It elevates the issue beyond just church politics or fairness.
Oh, absolutely. It becomes a matter of ontological necessity. The failure to embody the dual nature mandated by Christ isn't just wrong, it's actively delaying the fulfillment of the divine timeline for humanity and the cosmos.
So the task for the modern era, according to this framework, is inescapable.
To heal
This internal schism, not just by tinkering, but by reinstating that foundational dual authority from within.
Yes, it's about restoring the integrity of the uterus Maria so it can fulfill its generative purpose.
Now, the source isn't entirely dismissive of history. It does acknowledge that there have been efforts, particularly in more recent times, to address some of these issues.
Right. It's not a completely negative view of the last few centuries. It specifically points to several reform-minded popes figures like Leo XIII, John the 23rd, Paul VI, even John Paul I, and the current Pope Franciscus.
And what credit does it give them?
It acknowledges their collective impact in opening doors. Opening doors for social justice concerns, for ecumenical dialogue with other faiths, for liturgical renewal to make worship more accessible, and generally fostering a church that listens to the cry of the world, trying to reconnect with the suffering caused by those systems of domination.
So positive steps. Signs of life, maybe.
Signs of life, yes. Steps towards mitigating some of the damage caused by that long history of Constantinian co-option and imperial structure. Dialogue, listening, these are seen as good.
But there's always a but here, isn't there?
There is. The concluding thesis is absolutely clear. These reforms, while valuable and necessary, are fundamentally insufficient on their own.
Why insufficient?
Because they don't address the root cause. The work isn't finished, the source insists, until the core responsibility is met. The radical restoration of the Church's original structure from within, reinstating that shared equal leadership model between the Petrine and Magdalene principles. Only then, it argues, can the Church fulfill its actual divine purpose.
So reform is good, but it's not the cure. Without tackling the fundamental structure at the top, restoring those two ovaries, the underlying imbalance, the 1700-year schism persists.
Exactly. You can change the language, you can update rituals, you can express concern for the poor, but if the basic governance model is still operating on that singular, historically patriarchal foundation,
It's still ultimately reflecting the sin of the Neolithic Revolution, the sin of unequal power.
that's the argument. It's still embodying imbalance. So gradual change, gradual evolution within the existing structure, it's not enough.
What's needed then is something more drastic.
Yes. The situation, as presented, demands a revolutionary shift back to the original mandate, which leads us directly to the core declaration, the real call to action in this text.
Which is summed up in that really striking Latin phrase.
Crede Ecclesia Catholicus revolutionanda ecclesia senda renovanda est.
And the translation is pretty direct, isn't it?
It's blunt and powerful. The Church must be revolutionized and continuously renewed. It's not a suggestion. It's framed as a statement of fact, a theological necessity. Revolution isn't an external attack. It's part of the Church's inherent need for ongoing life and fidelity to its origin.
And this leads to a mandate of resistance.
Yes. The text follows up by declaring that Christianity is fundamentally not a creed of passivity, but a movement of resistance.
Resistance against what, specifically?
Resistance against those very forces, it argues, co-opted the Church, the distortions of empire, patriarchy, and capital, all seen as flowing from that Constantinian compromise and ultimately tracing back to the principles established in the Neolithic fall.
So it's reclaiming Christianity's roots as something countercultural, something challenging dominant power structures.
Precisely. Affirming that the most authentic form of the faith is inherently revolutionary, inherently communal, inherently egalitarian. It's a rejection of assimilation into worldly power.
And here's where it connects the structural argument back to that deep philosophical, even cosmic level we started with.
Right. It makes this profound claim that ontology, what fundamentally exists, the structure of reality, epistemology, how we know things, what counts as true knowledge and ethics, what we ought to do, how we should act, are not separate domains.
They're unified.
They're unified expressions of the same underlying resonance or reality. Let me try an analogy for you listening. Think about, say, the structure of a musical instrument that's its ontology, its physical reality.
Okay.
How accurately that instrument allows you to understand and produce musical harmony. That's its epistemology, its capacity for knowledge.
Yeah.
And how you actually play it, the music you create, that's the ethics, the action.
So if the instrument itself is flawed, say out of tune or structurally unsound, ontology.
Then your ability to know or create true harmony, epistemology, is compromised. And the music you produce, ethics, will inevitably be discordant or wrong.
Applying that to the Church then. If its fundamental structure, ontology, is patriarchal, unbalanced, missing its Magdalene half,
then its knowledge, epistemology, of God's full, dual, egalitarian nature will necessarily be incomplete, partial. And its actions, its governance, its ethical life, ethics, will inevitably reflect and perpetuate that original sin of domination and imbalance.
Wow, so restoring the equal leadership isn't just about fixing the church's internal politics.
Not at all. It's presented as a fundamental correction of reality. It's about aligning the church's very being, knowing, and doing with the true nature of the deus of cosmos, the evolving communal God, making the structure match the divine reality.
So the quest for sacred equality becomes an act of realizing God's nature here and now.
Exactly. Rejecting empire is rejecting separation. Affirming equality is affirming communion. It's the practical path to overcoming both the 1700-year church schism and the 12,000-year sociological schism of the fall.
And this commitment to radical change goes right down to the very words used in prayer.
Yes. The final detail highlighted is the deliberate proposed change in the Trinitarian formula. Instead of "in the name of the Father," pater, it suggests using the Latin word parens.
Parens meaning parent, gender neutral.
Precisely. The proposed blessing becomes "in nomine parens et filii et spiritus sancti. Amen." In the name of the parent and of the child and of the Holy Spirit.
That's a significant shift. What's the theological statement there?
It's the ultimate declaration that the revolution must permeate everything, even the core language used to describe God. It asserts that the traditionally masculine term father, while historically dominant, is itself perhaps a product of that patriarchal co-option by empire.
So using parent aims to reflect the more inclusive, balanced, perhaps evolving nature of the Godhead described earlier, removing the structural bias even from the name of God.
That seems to be the intent. It ensures that the critique of patriarchy extends to the most sacred concepts, making the language itself reflect the call for restored equality and a move away from exclusively masculine imagery for the divine source. It's saying the liturgical language itself needs renewal to align with the deeper dual reality. #tag outro.
Well, that has been an absolutely extraordinary journey, a deep dive into a framework that, it rewrites cosmology, human history, the nature of sin, and the entire mission of faith, all in one go.
It's incredibly ambitious, incredibly cohesive in its own way.
If we had to boil it down, looking back, the two theological shifts that feel most radical are probably first, that idea of the evolving quantum God, God as the universe, unfolding and developing with it.
Making the cosmos inherently divine.
And second, that complete redefinition of the fall, not as individual disobedience, but as a sociological catastrophe rooted in the Neolithic Revolution, the invention of hierarchy, domination, and enclosure.
Yes, those two pillars really support the entire structure of the argument.
And when you tie those threads together, as the source does, the conclusion is stark.
It is. The framework demands that the church must rise, as it says, not as empire, but as revolution. It insists that communion, shared power, sacred equality, these aren't just nice ideas or modern adaptations.
They're the only path.
They're presented as the only path to actually realizing the kingdom of God among the living. The only way to heal both that 12,000-year-old wound of domination and the 1,700-year-old structural imbalance within the church itself. It connects internal church structure directly to global social healing.
Truly challenging stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you, sincerely, for sharing these incredible sources with us for this deep dive. It gives us, and hopefully you listening, a lot to think about.
It certainly does.
Okay, so, as always, we leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. Something to take away from this. Given that this theology ties the healing of the church so directly, so explicitly, to the healing of wider social inequality, specifically connecting it back to the Neolithic Revolution's acts of enclosure and domination, what specific steps, thinking beyond just the theological or internal church structures, would actually be necessary in the material world today to fully rectify that 12,000-year-old schism? If the original sin was, at its heart, about the privatization of land and the creation of hierarchical labor, what kind of economic, social, or communal structures would we need to establish among the living right now to truly manifest that restored egalitarian state of Eden that this source envisions? What does undoing enclosure actually look like in the 21st century? Something to think about. Until next time on The Deep Dive.